I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flip the table. I just slid my chair back and realized, in a room full of people who claimed to be my family, I was the only one who hadn't been invited to the truth. The silence came first. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind that presses against your ears until you can hear your own pulse. We were sitting in a private dining room on the second floor of a restaurant I couldn't pronounce correctly without checking the menu twice. Polished wood, low lighting. The kind of place where the waitstaff moved like they were trained to disappear. Everyone else had already eaten. That should have told me everything. The text had come at 3:17 p.m. on Christmas Day, while snow slid lazily down the windows of the house I'd lived in for 11 years without ever fully belonging to. Dinner tonight, 7:45. Don't be late. No greeting, no warmth, just instruction. I stared at the screen longer than I'd admit to anyone. My wife, Linda, was already gone for the day, said she needed family time. Her son, Aaron, hadn't spoken to me in weeks unless he needed something fixed or paid. So I did what I'd always done. I replied, "See you there," and went upstairs to get ready like a man reporting for duty. I chose the gray blazer, the safe one, the one people described as solid. That word had followed me most of my adult life. Solid, dependable, reliable. Words that sounded like compliments until you realized they were usually said right before someone handed you a problem and walked away. The drive downtown was slow, streets half-plowed, traffic lights blinking red against a sky that looked permanently undecided. Christmas songs drifted faintly from another car at a stoplight, cheerful in a way that felt almost insulting. I parked, handed my keys to a valet, who smiled without seeing me, and stepped into warmth that smelled like money. They were already there. Linda sat at the center of the table, laughing too loudly, cheeks flushed from wine. Her brother, Mark, leaned back with his arms crossed, the satisfied posture of a man who had just finished something expensive. Across from them, Aaron scrolled on his phone, smirking at something I wasn't meant to be part of. Every plate was empty, every glass partially drained. I stood there for a moment, coat still on, feeling like I'd arrived at the wrong scene halfway through a film. The server hovered nearby, pretending to check his tablet while clocking the dynamic instantly. Aaron looked up first. "Oh," he said, loud enough for the nearby table to glance over. "You actually came." I pulled out a chair slowly. "Looks like I missed dinner." Linda waved a hand dismissively. There was a mix-up with the timing. Mark chuckled. "Happens." Aaron reached for the leather folder at the edge of the table and slid it toward me. The motion was smooth, practiced. "But you can still participate," he said. I opened it. The numbers were clean. Confident. 4 figures without apology. Steaks. Wine. Add-ons, I knew. Cost extra because they always did. My name wasn't on the top of the bill, but everyone at the table was looking at me like it might as well have been. The heat crept up my neck, not as embarrassment, but as recognition. This wasn't a mistake. This was theater. "Don't make it weird," Linda said, her voice tight but smiling. "It's Christmas." Something settled in my chest then. Not anger, not humiliation, something colder than both. For years I'd been the man behind the scenes, the one who handled what other people didn't want to look at. Mortgage renewals, tax extensions, late notices intercepted before they turned into conversations. I'd learned how to absorb chaos quietly so the house could stay calm. And here I was, sitting in a room full of people who believed my role in the family was to make consequences disappear. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back on the table. "You're right," I said evenly. "It's time to settle things." They laughed. All of them. Like I just told a joke that landed a second too late. I paid the bill. Every cent. I wished them a pleasant evening, stood up and walked out without looking back. The cold outside hit me like a slap. Clean. Honest. Snow drifted under the streetlights, indifferent to whatever had just shifted inside me. I sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key, my reflection in the windshield older than I remembered. At home, I didn't turn on the lights. I went straight to the hallway closet, the one no one else ever opened. I pulled down the file box, set it on the kitchen table, and lifted the lid. Folders, statements, printed emails saved, just in case. And there it was. My name, typed neatly on a document I had never signed, attached to an obligation I had never agreed to carry. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I exhaled slowly. Dinner hadn't been the worst thing they'd done, not even close. The house was quiet in that hollow, post-holiday way. Decorations still up, meaning already gone. A strand of white lights blinked softly in the window, reflected back at me like a question I'd avoided answering for years. I read the document again, slower this time. It was tied to a business structure Mark liked to call the family venture. According to the paperwork, I wasn't just advising anymore. I was listed as a secondary guarantor on a line of credit. No conversation, no signature. Just my name, placed confidently where consent should have been. I wasn't shocked. That was the strange part. When you've been taken advantage of long enough, the proof doesn't explode. It settles, quietly, like cold water seeping into your boots while you're pretending everything's fine. For over a decade, I'd been the one keeping things afloat. Linda handled appearances, I handled reality. I was the one up late every spring spreading documents across this same table, making sure nobody tripped an audit. I smoothed overdrafts before they were noticed, renewed policies, made problems smaller before they had names. Nobody ever asked me to stop. Nobody ever thanked me. I flipped through another folder and found an old email chain, printed and clipped. Relax. He worries too much. He'll handle it. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I wasn't angry. I was awake. And for the first time in a very long while, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't loyalty. It was exploitation. And if I didn't step back now, I was going to pay for their choices with the rest of my life. The letter arrived 3 days later, wedged between a grocery flyer and a holiday card from a neighbor whose name I still couldn't remember. White envelope. Government return address. The kind that tightens something in your chest before you even open it. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd balanced other people's lives for years, and slid my finger under the flap. Internal Revenue Service. Request for verification. Potential discrepancies related to reported liabilities. The words were polite, clinical. They didn't accuse. They didn't threaten. They didn't have to. They referenced an entity I recognized immediately. The family venture. The credit line. My name. I read it twice, then a third time. Each passed slower than the last. This was the part no one talks about when you spend a lifetime being responsible. When things go right, you're invisible. When they go wrong, your name is already in the system. My chest felt tight, not pain, exactly. Pressure. Like my body knew something my mind was still catching up to. That afternoon, I drove to my doctor's office under the excuse of a routine check. The waiting room was half empty, holiday decorations still clinging to relevance. A nurse wrapped the cuff around my arm and frowned slightly at the numbers. Stress? She asked. Family, I said. She nodded like she'd heard that answer more times than she could count. You can't carry everything forever. I almost laughed. If only it were that simple. That night, Linda came home late. She moved through the kitchen like nothing had happened, setting her purse down, opening the fridge, commenting on leftovers. The choreography of a life that assumed I would always be there to absorb whatever weight landed next. You were quiet today, she said. I got a letter. She sighed before I could finish. If this is about dinner, it's from the IRS. That stopped her. She took the paper, skimmed it quickly, then pushed it back like it was a minor inconvenience. This doesn't mean anything. Mark deals with stuff like this all the time. My name is on it. She waved a hand. You're overreacting. You always do this, making things bigger than they are. Old reflexes kicked in. The part of me trained to smooth, to minimize, to let things go for the sake of peace. I felt it rise, and then I felt something else override it. I'm not incompetent, I said quietly. She looked at me like I'd broken script. I don't have the energy for this tonight. She went upstairs and closed the door. I stayed at the table long after the house went dark, staring at the letter like it might rearrange itself if I waited long enough. That was the night I stopped hoping things would fix themselves. The next morning, I made 2 calls, one to an attorney downtown, one to my bank. Both meetings were calm, professional, devastating. You didn't sign this? The attorney asked, flipping through the documents. No. She nodded slowly. Your name appears enough to establish exposure. If this entity defaults, you could lose assets. Credit, retirement. The banker didn't soften it. You should have been removed months ago. Someone benefited from keeping you where you were. I thought of Aaron's smirk, the bill sliding across the table. The assumption. That night I sat in the living room with the lights off. watching snow fall again, slow and steady. I thought about the man I tried to be. Patient, steady, easy to rely on. I thought about what that man had cost me. It wasn't anger pushing me forward. It was survival. The pen trembled slightly when I signed the first withdrawal notice. Once it was done, something inside me eased, not relief, resolve. I wasn't starting a war. I was stepping out of the blast radius. The silence that followed was immediate. Emails stopped coming. Bank alerts rerouted. Questions that used to land quietly in my inbox didn't. At first it felt wrong. Like waking up in a house where the clock had stopped ticking. Then I understood what it really was. They had noticed. I started waking before dawn. Coffee brewing in the dark. The file box pulled fully out of the closet for the first time. Not halfway. Not within reach. Fully out, lid open. This wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Dates, names, authorizations. Every place my name appeared where it shouldn't have. Every email that dismissed concern as overreaction. Every "will handle it" that meant "you will." Around noon on Wednesday, my phone buzzed. Aaron, bank keeps asking questions. Did you talk to them? I stared at the message, then set the phone face down. An hour later, Linda called. What's going on? She asked, her voice softer now. Mark's stressed. He says the bank wants paperwork we already gave them. I'm sure they do, I said. You sound distant. I am. A pause. Why are you doing this now? I thought about the restaurant, the empty plates, the laughter, because now it matters. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was tight. This feels extreme. It's documentation, I said, nothing more. That evening, the group chat lit up again. Jokes, emojis, a performance of calm. I didn't join. Instead, I mailed formal notices. Clean language, no accusations, just facts. Each envelope dropped into the mailbox felt heavier than the last, not because I was afraid, but because a part of me still wanted to be liked. That part didn't get a vote anymore. Late that night, Linda came downstairs and leaned against the counter, studying me like she was seeing a stranger. You're different, she said. I know. Are you trying to punish us? I looked at her then. Really looked. I'm trying not to drown. She didn't argue. She just nodded once and went back upstairs. The next morning, an email came through from the bank. Meeting requested. All parties required. I forwarded it to everyone. No commentary. They thought it was an inconvenience. They didn't know the ground had already shifted. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. I arrived 10 minutes early, out of habit more than nerves. The bank's conference room sat on the 4th floor. All glass in neutral colors, decorated with framed photos meant to suggest stability bridges, skylines, people shaking hands. There was a small artificial Christmas tree in the corner, one strand of white lights still blinking like it hadn't gotten the memo that the holidays were over. I took the seat closest to the door. I'd always liked knowing where the exit was. Linda came in next. Her heels clicked too fast for someone pretending to be calm. She gave me a tight smile and sat across from me, purse clutched in her lap like a shield. She didn't speak. Mark and Aaron arrived together a few minutes later, loud in the way people get when they assume they're still in control. Mark clapped me on the shoulder as he passed. Didn't have to turn this into a whole thing, he said. Aaron smirked. Banks love paperwork. You of all people should know that. I nodded once, said nothing. The compliance officer entered first. Mid-40s. Neat haircut. Calm eyes. His nameplate read Thomas Reed. Right behind him came a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a slim briefcase. Good morning, she said. I'm Rachel Coleman, counsel for Mr. Hayes. That was the first crack. Aaron's smile faltered. Mark blinked. Linda turned toward me like she was seeing me for the first time that day. Rachel sat beside me and opened her folder without ceremony. Thomas cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. We requested this meeting to clarify obligations related to the venture and associated lines of credit. Mark leaned back. We've been through this before. Yes, Thomas said calmly, but circumstances have changed. He slid a document across the table, not to Mark. To me, Mr. Hayes submitted formal withdrawal notices 30 days ago, Thomas continued. Effective immediately, he is no longer an authorized signer, guarantor, or fiduciary in relation to the venture. The room went still. Linda's grip tightened around her purse. Aaron sat forward. That can't be right. As live, Rachel's voice was even. It is. All notices were filed properly and acknowledged. Mark frowned. He wouldn't do that without talking to us. I met his eyes. I tried. Thomas tapped the paper lightly. This withdrawal prompted a review. During that review, several irregularities came to light. Irregularities? Aaron snapped. Documentation gaps, unauthorized extensions, reliance on secondary guarantors who did not sign original agreements. He looked directly at Mark. Specifically, you. Mark's face reddened. This is ridiculous. Rachel slid a thicker folder across the table. These are the records. Dates, emails, filings. Aaron reached for it, then stopped himself. Thomas continued. Because Mr. Hayes withdrew before liability was triggered, he is no longer exposed. Linda's breath caught. However, Thomas said, the venture will need to restructure immediately. Otherwise, the credit line may be frozen. Aaron shot to his feet. You're saying he just walked away? I folded my hands on the table. I stepped aside. Mark stared at me, disbelief cracking his voice. After everything we did for you, Rachel answered for me. After everything he did for you. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, earned. I let it sit. I'd learned something important over the years. Silence makes people reveal themselves. Linda whispered, barely audible. No, that can't be. Aaron laughed sharply, the sound brittle. This is a setup. You planned this. I looked at him. Really looked. The certainty he'd always carried. The assumption that the ground would hold no matter how hard he leaned. I planned not to be responsible for things I never agreed to, I said. Mark slumped back in his chair, suddenly smaller. Thomas closed his folder. We'll follow up with next steps in writing. Rachel gathered her papers and stood. Our part is done. As we moved toward the door, Linda followed me into the hallway. What did you do? She asked, her voice shaking. What did you do? I stopped and faced her. I stopped paying for disrespect. Her eyes filled. She reached for my arm, then let her hand fall. Inside the conference room, voices rose, muffled, frantic. I didn't turn back. The drive home was quiet. No radio. No calls. The streets were wet from melting snow, the sky low and colorless. Everything looked the same, and yet it wasn't. The weight between my shoulders felt lighter, like I'd set something down without realizing how heavy it had been. The house greeted me with familiar sounds, the furnace humming, the faint tick of the clock. I hung my coat, set my keys down, and stood there for a moment, breathing. Linda didn't come home that night. She texted instead. I'm staying at Mark's. We need time. I turned the phone face down, not out of anger, out of something new. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. The quiet that followed wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with slammed doors or shouted accusations. It came the way winter does after the first hard snow, slow, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The emails stopped first. The automatic forwards that had once landed in my inbox like clockwork went silent. Bank alerts rerouted. Calendar reminders disappeared. The steady stream of responsibility that had flowed toward me for years simply ended. At first, it felt wrong, like waking up in a house where the clock had stopped ticking. I kept checking my phone out of habit, waiting for something to break, something to demand my attention. Nothing did. They were scrambling. I knew that without being told. Mark had to bring in an outside advisor. The venture's accounts were reviewed under tighter scrutiny. Certain expenses that had once been waved through suddenly required explanation. The credit line wasn't frozen, but it wasn't comfortable anymore either. Comfort had always depended on my presence. Aaron went quiet. No texts, no jokes, no casual assumptions. His confidence had always rested on the belief that someone else would clean up after him. When that belief cracked, so did the noise. Linda stayed away longer than I expected. Days passed. Then a week. Then another. Her absence changed the house in subtle ways. Less movement, less noise, fewer half-finished conversations. The silence felt different now, not hollow, not tense, spacious. I slept, not perfectly, not deeply at first, but without waking up at 3 a.m. with numbers chasing each other through my head. I stopped bracing myself when the mail arrived. When the phone rang, I let it ring if I didn't feel like answering. The world didn't end. I started walking again. Slow loops through the neighborhood, hands in my pockets, breath visible in the cold air. I noticed things I'd lived beside for years without seeing. The way one porch light flickered when the wind picked up. The sound of a screen door slamming somewhere down the block. Ordinary details I'd missed while managing other people's emergencies. One afternoon, I sat on a bench at the park and watched a grandfather teach his grandson how to throw a football. No shouting, no pressure, just patience. The kid missed more than he hit. The man didn't rush him. That word stayed with me. Patience. It occurred to me then how little of it I'd ever given myself. I'd mistaken endurance for character, thought that carrying more meant being more. I'd believed that if I could just hold everything together quietly enough, it would turn into appreciation. It never does. People don't value what doesn't resist. Linda called 2 weeks later. "Can we talk?" she asked. We met at a diner just off the highway. Neutral ground, vinyl booths, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed the same way since the 90s. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. The confidence she'd worn so easily before now sat awkwardly on her. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," she said after a long silence. I stirred my coffee. "I tried to tell you." She nodded slowly. I didn't listen. We talked for over an hour. About fear, about loyalty, about how easy it is to confuse silence with stability. She apologized, not dramatically, not perfectly, but sincerely. "I'm not going back to how things were," I said. "If we move forward, it has to be different. Boundaries, respect, or not at all." She swallowed. "I understand." We didn't decide everything that day. We didn't need to. For the first time, the decision didn't feel one-sided. When I got home, I went to the closet and pulled out the old file box. I didn't open it. I carried it to the garage and set it on a high shelf out of reach, but not thrown away. Some records you keep not because you need them, but because they remind you who you used to be. The house felt different after that winter, though nothing about it physically changed. Same creak in the third stair, same porch light, same dining table where I'd spent years sorting out other people's obligations. But the air felt lighter. I began to notice how much of my life had been built around being available. Always reachable, always ready. I had confused being needed with being valued. There's a difference between commitment and erasure, and I had crossed that line years ago without noticing. Mark never apologized, not directly. He sent a short email months later, polite, stiff, full of words like misunderstanding and unfortunate timing. I read it once and archived it. Aaron didn't reach out at all. That told me everything I needed to know. I started doing small things for myself again. Ordinary things I'd once dismissed as indulgent, morning walks without a destination, cooking meals because I felt like it, letting the phone sit unanswered without guilt. Peace, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly when you stop betraying yourself to keep other people comfortable. The Christmas dinner came back to me one last time, the empty plates, the laughter, the folders sliding across the table. They had thought money was the only thing I brought to the family. They forgot I was the one who kept the lights on. And once I stopped doing that quietly, everything else had to change. I used to believe strength was measured by how much you could carry without complaining, how many problems you could absorb, how quiet you could stay while everything leaned on you. That belief cost me years. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in small, invisible ways. In nights spent fixing things no one knew were broken. In conversations I swallowed because speaking felt inconvenient. In the way my name slowly became synonymous with responsibility instead of respect. The hardest part wasn't realizing I'd been taken advantage of. It was realizing how long I'd helped make it possible. When you spend enough time being the steady one, people stop asking if you're okay carrying the weight. They just assume you will. And when you finally step back, they don't thank you for your honesty. They panic, they accuse, they rewrite the story. I had to be willing to let that happen. Linda and I kept talking, carefully, over the months that followed. Some conversations ended well, others didn't. There were days when she looked at me like she was grieving someone who was still alive. Maybe she was. The version of me who smoothed things over, who paid quietly, who chose peace over dignity every time. That man was gone. Not because I hated her, not because I wanted revenge, but because staying that way had started to feel like erasing myself. I thought often about that moment at the restaurant. The empty plates, the laughter, the bill sliding across the table, like it was nothing more than an expectation. They hadn't meant it as cruelty. That was the most dangerous part. They had meant it as normal. That's how you know a line has been crossed. When disrespect stops looking like an insult and starts looking like routine. Life didn't become perfect after that winter. It became honest. There were consequences. Of course there were. Relationships shifted. Some disappeared entirely. The roles I'd played for years were reassigned or simply left unfilled. And yes, there were moments of loneliness that cut sharper than I expected. But there was also something new. Space. Space to think without calculating someone else's reaction. Space to rest without guilt. Space to decide who I was when I wasn't being useful to someone else. I stopped waking up afraid of the day. I stopped bracing myself for the mail. I stopped feeling like my value depended on how smoothly other people's lives ran. One afternoon, months later, I found myself back at that same diner. Same vinyl booths, same burnt coffee. I watched people come and go, couples leaning toward each other, strangers sharing space without obligation. It struck me how simple respect actually is when no one is keeping score. I thought about the man I'd been for most of my life. The one who believed endurance was the same thing as love. The one who thought silence was strength. I didn't hate that man. He did the best he knew how with what he had been taught. But I didn't want to live as him anymore. Here's what I know now, and what I wish someone had told me years earlier. Being responsible is not a flaw. Being reliable is not a weakness. But being invisible will cost you everything if you let it. There is a difference between helping and being used, between loyalty and self-erasure, between peace and avoidance. And if you are always the one fixing things, always the one paying financially, emotionally, spiritually, ask yourself something honestly. If you stop fixing things tomorrow, who would still be there for you? That question isn't meant to make you angry. It's meant to make you awake. Some people will only value you as long as you're useful. When you stop being convenient, they will call it betrayal. Let them. You are not cruel for stepping back. You are not selfish for drawing boundaries. You are not wrong for choosing yourself when the alternative is drowning. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do isn't to carry more. It's to set the weight down and walk away from what never should have been his to hold. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. In the comments, just type 0 if you've ever felt like the walking wallet, the fixer, the invisible one in your family. 1 if you've reached the point where you're done paying for disrespect and ready to choose yourself. No explanations needed, just the number. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about quiet resolve, hard-earned boundaries, and men who stop disappearing in their own lives, consider subscribing. Not for drama, not for shouting, but for the truth most people don't say out loud until it costs them years. Because silence isn't strength forever, and it's never too late to stop paying for disrespect.